Roy Orbison didn't die from a heart attack. He died from a life so cruel it had already killed him a dozen times over, leaving only a voice that haunted the darkness and a pair of sunglasses that hid tears the world was never meant to see. The man who sang "Only the Lonely" knew loneliness in ways that would destroy lesser souls, yet transformed that agony into songs that made millions weep for sorrows they had never experienced. December 6, 1988. The Big O collapsed in his mother's bathroom in Hendersonville, Tennessee, his massive heart finally succumbing to the weight of grief it had carried for over 2 decades. At 52, Roy Kelton Orbison had survived the deaths of his first wife, 2 of his children, financial ruin, career resurrection, and the kind of personal tragedies that read like a country song written by a sadistic god. But he had never stopped singing, never stopped pouring his pain into melodies that transcended the circumstances that created them. The official cause of death was listed as myocardial infarction, but those who knew his story understood the deeper truth. Roy Orbison had been murdered by fate itself, a cosmic conspiracy that systematically destroyed everything he loved while preserving the one thing that could articulate the destruction: his voice. Every note he sang was for someone he had lost, and by the end, he had lost almost everyone. When news of his death broke, it sent shockwaves through a music world that had only recently rediscovered his genius through the traveling Wilburys and his comeback album Mystery Girl. The tributes poured in from fellow artists who understood that they had lost not just a colleague, but the purest expression of human suffering transformed into beauty. Elvis had called him the greatest singer in the world, but even Elvis never carried the weight of sorrow that Roy bore with such dignity. But to understand how a shy boy from Texas became the voice of cosmic loneliness, and then a cautionary tale about the price of loving too deeply in a world too cruel, we must journey back to the oil fields of Vernon, Texas, where a young man first learned that the only refuge from life's brutality was the darkness behind sunglasses and the light that lived in song. The story begins in the hardscrabble oil country of East Texas, where Roy Kelton Orbison entered the world on April 23, 1936, during the height of the Great Depression. Born to Orby Lee and Nadine Orbison, he arrived into circumstances that would teach him early lessons about loss, resilience, and the power of music to transcend immediate circumstances. His father worked the oil fields when work was available, while his mother provided the emotional stability that would later inform Roy's understanding of love's fragility and preciousness. The Orbison household was one where music served as both entertainment and emotional sanctuary during times when material comforts were scarce. Young Roy's first instrument was a guitar given to him on his 6th birthday, a gift that represented significant sacrifice for a family struggling with economic uncertainty. That guitar became his constant companion and his first teacher in the alchemy of transforming pain into beauty. Even as a child, Roy possessed qualities that set him apart from his peers in ways that were both blessing and burden. His voice, even in childhood, carried an otherworldly quality that seemed to emerge from some deep well of emotion that shouldn't have existed in someone so young. But along with this gift came a shyness so profound that he struggled with basic social interactions, finding comfort only in the privacy of musical expression. The family's move to Wink, Texas, when Roy was 8, marked the beginning of his serious musical education, but also his first encounters with the social dynamics that would shape his relationship with performance and fame. Wink was a small oil town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Roy's unusual talent made him both celebrated and isolated. He was the boy who could sing like an angel but couldn't order food in a restaurant without stammering. His first public performances came through local talent shows and school events, where his extraordinary voice commanded attention while his personality seemed to shrink from the spotlight. The contradiction between his musical confidence and personal insecurity would become a defining characteristic of his entire career. creating both the authentic vulnerability that made his music so powerful and the emotional distance that would later contribute to his isolation. The discovery of his operatic range during high school revealed the true scope of his vocal gifts, while also highlighting how different he was from his rockabilly contemporaries. While other young men were trying to sound like Elvis or Jerry Lee Lewis, Roy was developing a style that drew from classical training, country tradition, and something entirely his own that seemed to channel cosmic sadness through human vocal cords. His early bands, including the Wink Westerners, provided necessary experience in performance and collaboration while also teaching him about the economics and politics of the music business. But even within these group settings, Roy remained fundamentally alone, the shy genius whose talent elevated everyone around him while his personality kept him separate from the camaraderie that sustained other musicians. The decision to pursue music professionally was both inevitable and terrifying for someone whose natural instinct was to avoid attention rather than seek it. But the alternative, a life in the oil fields or other manual labor, seemed even more impossible for someone whose gifts demanded expression regardless of the personal cost. The choice to leave the security of small-town Texas for the uncertainties of musical success represented an act of courage that would prove both prophetic and tragic. By the time he graduated high school, Roy Orbison had developed the musical abilities and emotional depth that would later make him a legend, but he had also established patterns of isolation and vulnerability that would make him particularly susceptible to the tragedies that fate seemed determined to visit upon him. The question that would define his life was whether talent and sensitivity could coexist with the kind of resilience required to survive in a business that consumed the vulnerable while celebrating their pain. The late 1950s marked Roy Orbison's entry into the professional music world, but also his first encounters with the systematic inequalities and casual cruelties that characterized the early rock and roll industry. His association with Sun Records in Memphis, the legendary label that had launched Elvis Presley, provided access to professional recording facilities and industry connections, while also exposing him to the complex dynamics of fame, competition, and artistic compromise. At Sun Records, Roy found himself in the company of musical revolutionaries like Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, and Jerry Lee Lewis, but his personality and style set him apart from the extroverted showmanship that defined most of his label mates. While others commanded attention through charisma and stage presence, Roy's power came from vulnerability and the ability to make listeners feel emotions they hadn't known they were capable of experiencing. The recording of songs like Ooby Dooby showcased his ability to work within the rockabilly style that Sun favored, but they also revealed the limitations of trying to fit his unique talents into conventional categories. Roy's voice was too operatic for pure country, too emotional for standard rock and roll, and too sophisticated for the teenage market that drove most of the industry's commercial decisions. His friendship with Elvis Presley during this period provided both inspiration and intimidation, as he witnessed firsthand how fame could transform a shy young man from the South into a global phenomenon while also observing the personal costs that such transformation demanded. Elvis's praise for Roy's vocal abilities, calling him the greatest singer in the world, provided validation while also creating pressure to live up to expectations that seemed impossible to sustain. The departure from Sun Records in 1958 was both necessary for his artistic development and painful for someone who struggled with change and uncertainty. While Sam Phillips and Sun had provided the platform for his professional debut, the label's focus on rockabilly limited his ability to explore the more sophisticated musical territory that his voice demanded. The move to Monument Records would prove creatively liberating, but also mark the beginning of the personal tragedies that would define the rest of his life. Monument Records, under the guidance of producer Fred Foster, provided Roy with the creative freedom to develop his distinctive style, while also introducing him to the commercial pressures that would ultimately both make and break his career. The label understood that Roy's unusual qualities required different marketing and promotional strategies than those used for conventional rock stars. But they also recognized the commercial potential of properly channeling his gifts. The recording of Only the Lonely in 1960 marked Roy's breakthrough as a major recording artist. But the song also served as a prophetic statement about his future. The lyrics, which spoke of isolation, romantic disappointment, and the kind of existential sadness that seemed to permeate his being, would prove to be less artistic creation than autobiography. He was singing his own destiny into existence with every note. The success of Only the Lonely established Roy as one of the most distinctive voices in popular music, while also creating expectations for additional material that could match its emotional impact and commercial appeal. The pressure to recreate such success would prove both motivating and exhausting, as each new song was measured against the standard he had set for expressing human suffering through popular music. His development of the Roy Orbison style, the dark sunglasses, the black clothing, the operatic vocal approach, and the dramatic staging, was both artistic choice and psychological necessity. The sunglasses, initially worn to cover his shyness and poor eyesight, became a trademark that allowed him to maintain emotional distance while performing the most vulnerable material imaginable. Behind those dark lenses, he could be simultaneously present and protected, visible and hidden. The image he cultivated was revolutionary in its rejection of rock and roll's typical energy and optimism. While most performers of the era celebrated youth, rebellion, and sexual liberation, Roy embodied a more complex understanding of human experience that included disappointment, loss, and the kind of beauty that could only emerge from suffering. He was creating a new archetype, the tragic romantic hero as rock star. But the very sensitivity that made his music so powerful also made him particularly vulnerable to the personal disasters that were already gathering on the horizon. His capacity for deep feeling, which translated into transcendent art, also meant that when tragedy struck, it would cut deeper and heal more slowly than it might for someone more emotionally protected. The early 1960s would establish Roy Orbison as one of the most important voices in popular music. But they would also set in motion the personal catastrophes that would test whether human resilience could match artistic genius, and whether the man behind the sunglasses could survive the very emotions that made his music immortal. The period from 1960 to 1964 represented the absolute peak of Roy Orbison's commercial and artistic success, but also the calm before the storm of personal tragedies that would redefine both his music and his life. During these years, he created the songs that would become his legacy while building the personal relationships that fate seemed determined to destroy. Crying, released in 1961, became more than just another hit song. It became Roy's artistic signature and emotional manifesto. The song's operatic structure, building from whispered vulnerability to soaring crescendo, established a template for emotional expression that no other artist could match. When Roy sang about crying, audiences understood that he knew the subject intimately, that his tears were not performance but documentation of lived experience. The success of Crying was followed by a string of hits that confirmed Roy's position as the premier balladeer of the rock era. But each song also revealed new depths of emotional territory that seemed almost dangerous to explore. Songs like Running Scared, In Dreams, and Blue Angel created a musical universe where love was always fragile, loss was inevitable, and beauty could only be glimpsed briefly before being snatched away by fate. His marriage to Claudette in 1957 had provided the personal happiness and stability that informed his understanding of love's possibilities. But it also created the vulnerability that would later make loss so devastating. Claudette was not just his wife, but his muse, his emotional anchor, and his connection to the normal world outside the strange reality of fame. When he sang about love, he was singing about her. When he sang about loss, he was unconsciously preparing for what was to come. The recording of "Oh, Pretty Woman" in 1964 marked the commercial peak of his career, becoming his only #1 hit and establishing him as a global superstar capable of transcending cultural and linguistic boundaries. The song's playful energy and accessible melody represented a departure from his typical dramatic style, proving his versatility while also providing the financial security that would later prove crucial during his years of personal tragedy. But even at the height of success, Roy remained fundamentally unchanged by fame. Still shy, still preferring the company of his family to the social obligations that success demanded, still more comfortable expressing himself through music than through conversation. The man who could command the attention of millions on stage remained someone who struggled to order food in restaurants or make small talk at industry parties. His relationship with the Beatles, who cited him as a major influence and invited him to tour with them, provided validation from the most important musical force of the era, while also highlighting how different his approach was from the optimistic energy that defined most popular music. When the Beatles sang about love, it was celebratory. When Roy sang about love, it was elegiac, as if he understood that all beautiful things were temporary. The development of his live performance style during this period created a template for dramatic presentation that influenced generations of performers while also revealing the emotional cost of constantly performing vulnerability for audiences. Roy's concerts became communal experiences of catharsis, where audiences could safely experience emotions that were too dangerous to feel in their daily lives. The black clothing, the stationary performance style, and the dramatic lighting created an atmosphere where music became ritual, and entertainment became something closer to religious experience. Roy didn't perform songs. He conducted ceremonies of shared sadness that left audiences both drained and purified. But for the man at the center of these emotional storms, the constant exposure to his own pain was beginning to take its toll. His relationship with fellow musicians during this period revealed both the respect his talent commanded and the isolation his personality created. Artists like Elvis, Johnny Cash, and later the Beatles all recognized his genius, but Roy remained fundamentally alone within the music community, too sensitive for the casual cruelties of the business, too shy for the social networking that sustained most careers. Behind all that success and growing recognition, was there a premonition of the disasters that fate was preparing? The themes of his most successful songs, loss, loneliness, and the fragility of happiness, seemed almost prophetic in their accuracy. It was as if Roy was unconsciously preparing both himself and his audiences for the tragedies that would soon transform him from a performer of imagined sorrows into someone whose real losses would make his fictional ones seem pale by comparison. The year 1966 began like any other for Roy Orbison, with touring commitments, recording sessions, and the comfortable rhythms of fame and family life that had sustained him through nearly a decade of success. But June 6, 1966 would prove to be the date when fate began its systematic destruction of everything Roy held dear, starting with the loss that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Claudette Orbison was riding her motorcycle near their home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, when she collided with a truck at an intersection. The woman who had inspired Roy's greatest love songs, who had provided the emotional stability that allowed his career to flourish, was killed instantly in an accident so random and senseless that it seemed like a cosmic joke with Roy as the unwilling punchline. The news of Claudette's death sent shockwaves through the music community. But for Roy, it represented something more catastrophic than professional sympathy could address. The loss of his wife was also the loss of his emotional anchor, his creative inspiration, and his connection to the normal world outside the strange reality of fame. The man who had sung about love and loss with such conviction now faced the reality that his prophetic songs had somehow summoned into existence. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy revealed both the music industry's capacity for support and its fundamental inability to comprehend losses that transcended professional considerations. Fellow musicians offered condolences and assistance, But the business itself continued to demand performances, recordings, and the kind of public appearances that seemed impossible for someone devastated by grief. Roy's response to Claudette's death was to retreat into the music with an intensity that worried those close to him. He threw himself into recording and performing with a dedication that seemed less like professional commitment than like a form of emotional self-medication. The stage became his sanctuary, the only place where he could transform his pain into something beautiful rather than simply endure it. But the isolation that had always characterized his personality became more pronounced after Claudette's death, as he struggled to maintain connections with a world that no longer contained the person who had made it meaningful. Friends and colleagues reported that Roy seemed to be performing life rather than living it, going through the motions of normalcy while remaining fundamentally disconnected from everything except his music. The songs he wrote during this period reflected a depth of understanding about loss that could only come from lived experience. Tracks like Too Soon to Know and Southbound Jericho Parkway carried emotional weight that made his earlier material seem almost lighthearted by comparison. He was no longer singing about the possibility of loss. He was documenting its reality with the precision of someone who had been to the bottom of human suffering and found his voice there. The responsibility of raising his 3 sons as a single father added practical challenges to the emotional devastation he was experiencing. Roy Jr., Anthony, and Wesley needed stability and parental attention at the very moment when their father was least capable of providing either. The man who could move millions with his voice struggled to find words to explain to his children why their mother would never come home. The touring schedule that had once provided escape from the pressures of fame now became a necessity for both financial and emotional reasons. Performing allowed Roy to channel his grief into something productive while also providing the income necessary to support his family. But the constant travel and emotional exposure required by live performance were exhausting for someone already pushed to his psychological limits. His relationship with alcohol during this period became both coping mechanism and additional source of concern for those who cared about him. While he never became what the industry would consider a serious alcoholic, his drinking increased noticeably as he sought any relief from the weight of grief that seemed to grow heavier rather than lighter with time. The question that haunted this period was whether it was possible to survive losses so profound while continuing to perform the very emotions that had been ripped from his life. Roy was being asked to sing about love for audiences who still possessed it, to perform hope for people who had never known despair, to transform his most private agony into public entertainment. But fate was not finished with Roy Orbison. The cruelty that had taken Claudette was preparing an even more devastating blow that would test whether human endurance had any limits at all, or whether some losses were simply too great for any soul to bear. September 14th, 1968. Roy Orbison was on tour in England when he received the phone call that would complete fate's systematic destruction of his family. A fire had broken out at his home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, trapping 2 of his sons, Roy Jr., age 10, and Anthony, age 6, in the flames. By the time firefighters arrived, both boys were dead from smoke inhalation, their small bodies found huddled together in what appeared to be an attempt to protect each other. The news reached Roy while he was preparing for a concert in Birmingham, England. The man who had already survived the death of his wife now faced a loss so incomprehensible that it seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human suffering. He had lost not just 2 children, but half of his reason for continuing to live, half of the future he had been building since Claudette's death. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy revealed the complete inadequacy of conventional condolences when confronted with losses of such magnitude. Fellow musicians, industry executives, and fans struggled to find words that could acknowledge what had happened without trivializing it through comparison to more ordinary forms of suffering. Roy had moved beyond the territory where normal human experience could provide comfort or guidance. His decision to complete the English tour rather than return immediately to Tennessee was both professional necessity and psychological self-preservation. Performing allowed him to channel his devastation into the only form of expression that had ever made sense of his pain, while returning home would have meant confronting the physical reality of a house where his children's voices would never again be heard. The concerts that followed were unlike anything Roy had ever performed before. Raw, desperate expressions of grief that left audiences shaken by their proximity to genuine human suffering. The man who had always sung about loss with artistic distance was now performing from the center of actual devastation, and the difference was both powerful and disturbing to witness. The songs took on new meanings as they emerged from a throat that had screamed in actual anguish rather than artistic expression. Crying became documentation rather than imagination. Only the lonely transformed from romantic lament to existential fact. Roy was no longer interpreting emotions. He was bleeding them directly onto audiences who had come for entertainment but received something closer to religious experience. The practical challenges of returning to Tennessee were overwhelming for someone already stretched beyond his psychological limits. The house where his children had died needed to be dealt with. Legal and insurance matters required attention, and his surviving son Wesley needed care from a father who could barely manage his own existence. The administrative details of tragedy proved almost as devastating as the tragedy itself. His relationship with Wesley became both his salvation and his torment during this period. The surviving child represented hope and continuity, but also a constant reminder of what had been lost. Every moment of joy with Wesley was shadowed by the absence of his brothers, every milestone a reminder of futures that would never be realized. The music industry's response to the second tragedy revealed both its capacity for genuine compassion and its underlying indifference to suffering that couldn't be monetized. While individual artists and executives expressed sincere sympathy, the business itself continued to operate according to its own logic, treating Roy's losses as unfortunate interruptions to his commercial viability rather than the kind of life-altering catastrophes that might require fundamental reconsideration of normal expectations. Roy's retreat from public life during the months following the fire was both necessary for his survival and damaging to his career momentum. In an industry that demanded constant presence and promotion, extended absence for any reason, even grief over the deaths of one's children, was viewed as professionally problematic. The man who had lost everything was now expected to return to work as if nothing had changed. The question that dominated this period was whether it was possible for any human being to absorb such losses and continue functioning, or whether Roy had reached the limits of what consciousness could endure without breaking permanently. He had become a test case for the outer boundaries of human resilience, a walking experiment in whether music could provide sufficient reason to continue living when life had taken everything else away. Every note he sang was for someone he had lost, and now that list included not just a wife but 2 children whose futures had been stolen by random chance and poor wiring. The man behind the sunglasses was crying tears that no audience should ever be asked to witness, yet somehow he continued to perform them. The decade following the death of his children marked Roy Orbison's descent into the kind of personal darkness that made his earlier songs about loneliness seem almost quaint by comparison. The man who had once sung about heartbreak now faced each day with the knowledge that the worst possible things had already happened, leaving him to navigate existence without the basic assumptions about safety and continuity that allow most people to function. His career during this period reflected the impossible position of an artist whose real life had become more tragic than any song he could write. The albums he recorded in the early 1970s, while musically sophisticated, carried emotional weight that was almost unbearable to experience. Roy was no longer creating art. He was documenting survival in real time, showing audiences what human endurance looked like when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The commercial performance of his later albums revealed the music industry's discomfort with authentic suffering that couldn't be packaged into acceptable entertainment categories. while his vocal abilities remained undiminished. If anything, they had gained depth and power through tragedy. The market seemed uncertain about how to sell the pain of someone who had lost everything. Happy endings were easier to market than ongoing devastation. His second marriage to Barbara Jacobs in 1969 provided both hope for recovery and additional complexity to his emotional landscape. Barbara's willingness to accept not just Roy but also his surviving son Wesley demonstrated a form of courage that the music industry rarely acknowledged. She was choosing to love someone whose capacity for loss had been proven beyond any reasonable doubt, someone whose emotional landscape had been permanently altered by experiences that most people couldn't survive. The birth of Roy Kelton Orbison Jr. in 1970 and Alexander Orbison in 1975 created new possibilities for happiness, while also generating fresh anxieties for a father who had learned that love and loss were often synonymous. Every moment of joy with his new children was shadowed by memories of what had been taken from him. Every milestone a reminder of how quickly happiness could be destroyed by forces beyond human control. His relationship with his surviving son Wesley became one of the most important connections in his life, but also one of the most complicated. Wesley had lost his mother and brothers while watching his father struggle with grief that seemed to have no bottom. The young man had to navigate his own trauma while serving as emotional anchor for someone whose famous voice could move millions but who struggled with the basic mechanics of daily existence. The financial pressures that accumulated during Roy's period of reduced activity revealed another aspect of the music industry's indifference to human suffering. While his catalog continued to generate revenue, the reduced income from touring and recording created practical problems that compounded the emotional devastation he was already experiencing. Grief was expensive, and the industry offered no insurance policies against the kind of losses that had destroyed his life. His ventures into other forms of entertainment, including acting and television appearances, provided both creative outlets and necessary income while highlighting how difficult it was for someone of his sensitivity to navigate the casual cruelties of show business. The man who could barely manage small talk was expected to promote himself and his work with the kind of enthusiasm that seemed obscene given what he had endured. The development of his later musical style showed an artist who had moved beyond conventional categories of popular music into something closer to spiritual expression. Songs like Life Fades Away and In Dreams, re-recorded with deeper understanding, became meditations on mortality, loss, and the possibility of meaning in a universe that seemed designed to cause maximum suffering to the most sensitive souls. His relationship with drugs during this period remained minimal compared to many of his contemporaries. But prescription medications for depression and anxiety became part of his daily routine. The man who had once relied solely on music to manage his emotions now needed pharmaceutical assistance to achieve even basic functionality. The question that haunted his friends and family during these years was whether Roy would eventually recover some form of happiness, or whether he had been fundamentally changed by losses that exceeded human capacity for healing. He seemed to exist in a state of functional devastation, capable of performing his professional obligations while remaining essentially broken in ways that might never mend. But music remained his sanctuary and his salvation. The one place where his pain could be transformed into something beautiful rather than simply endured. The voice that had once imagined suffering now documented it with the authority of lived experience, creating art that transcended entertainment to become something closer to testimony about what human beings could survive when they had no choice but to continue. The 1980s brought an unexpected renaissance to Roy Orbison's career that seemed almost miraculous given the depths from which he had been forced to climb. The revival began with younger artists discovering his influence and acknowledging their debt to his emotional honesty and vocal innovation. But it culminated in collaborations that proved his relevance to contemporary music while validating the artistic vision that had sustained him through his darkest years. David Lynch's use of "in dreams" in the film Blue Velvet in 1986 introduced Roy's music to a new generation while highlighting the haunting quality that had always set him apart from his contemporaries. Lynch's association of the song with disturbing imagery seemed to recognize something that mainstream audiences had perhaps missed, that Roy's music had always contained darkness that was both beautiful and unsettling. The formation of the Traveling Wilburys in 1988 represented both artistic triumph and personal validation for someone who had spent years isolated from the music community by his reputation for tragedy. His collaboration with Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne proved that his talents remained vital while providing the kind of creative stimulation that had been missing from his life since the loss of his family. The sessions for the Traveling Wilburys album revealed a side of Roy that few people had seen since the 1960s. Playful, engaged, and genuinely happy to be making music with peers who understood both his abilities and his suffering. The nickname Lefty Wilbury suggested someone who had found a way to participate in group creativity without sacrificing the distinctive identity that made him irreplaceable. The success of the Traveling Wilburys project generated momentum for Roy's first solo album in years, Mystery Girl, which would prove to be both his commercial comeback and his artistic swan song. The album showcased a voice that had gained depth and power through suffering while demonstrating that he retained the ability to create new material that honored his legacy, while pointing toward future possibilities. The recording sessions for Mystery Girl were marked by an energy and optimism that surprised those who had known Roy during his darkest years. He seemed to have found a way to channel his experiences into art without being consumed by them, creating music that acknowledged suffering while also celebrating the possibility of transcendence through creative expression. Songs like You Got It and She's a Mystery to Me, written by Bono and The Edge of U2, proved that Roy could adapt to contemporary production techniques while maintaining the distinctive style that had made him legendary. The album represented both a return to form and an evolution, showing an artist who had survived the worst possible losses while retaining the ability to create beauty from pain. His live performances during this period were revelatory for audiences who had known him only through recordings or who remembered him from his 1960s peak. The voice that had seemed almost too powerful for human throat to contain had gained additional resonance through lived experience, while his stage presence had acquired a gravity that came from having faced real tragedy and survived to sing about it. The Black and White Night concert in 1987, featuring guest appearances by Bruce Springsteen, Elvis Costello, K.D. Lang, and others, served as both celebration of his influence and demonstration of his continued relevance. The event proved that Roy's music had influenced an entire generation of performers while showcasing a voice that remained undiminished by age or suffering. But the Renaissance also highlighted how much Roy had changed during his years of struggle. The shy young man who had hidden behind sunglasses had evolved into someone whose presence carried the weight of authentic experience. He no longer seemed to be performing emotions. He was sharing them with audiences who recognized that they were witnessing something rare and precious. His relationship with his younger sons during this period provided evidence that healing was possible even for someone who had endured such losses. Roy Kelton Jr. and Alexander were old enough to understand their father's history, while young enough to bring joy that wasn't completely overshadowed by memories of what had been lost. The financial success of his comeback also provided security for his family while validating the artistic choices he had made throughout his career. The man who had been forgotten by the industry for nearly 2 decades was suddenly being celebrated as an influence on everyone from U2 to Bruce Springsteen, proving that authentic artistry could survive both personal tragedy and professional neglect. But even as success returned, Roy remained fundamentally changed by his experiences. The interviews he gave during this period revealed someone who had gained perspective on both success and failure that could only come from having experienced the extremes of both. He spoke about his losses with dignity while expressing gratitude for the opportunities that remained. The question that seemed to drive him during these final years was whether he could maintain the momentum of his comeback while preserving the emotional honesty that had made the comeback possible. He was no longer the shy young man who had stumbled into fame, but neither was he someone who could pretend that success could compensate for the losses that had defined his adult life. December 6, 1988, began as an ordinary day in the extraordinary life of a man who had learned to find meaning in small moments after losing faith in grand plans. Roy Orbison spent the afternoon at his mother's house in Hendersonville, Tennessee, the same town where he had buried his first wife and two of his children, but also the place where he had found the strength to rebuild some version of a life worth living. The heart attack that killed him was massive and sudden, striking without warning as he prepared for what should have been a routine evening. At 52, Roy's body finally succumbed to the accumulated stress of a life that had demanded more emotional endurance than any human being should be expected to provide. The heart that had powered the most distinctive voice in popular music simply stopped, as if it had finally carried all the sorrow it could contain. The timing of his death seemed cruel in its irony, just as his career was experiencing a renaissance that promised security and artistic fulfillment for his remaining years. Mystery Girl was completed but not yet released. The traveling Wilburys were planning additional projects, and Roy was finally receiving the recognition that his contributions to music deserved. Death had arrived just as life was becoming bearable again. The news of his passing sent shockwaves through a music community that had only recently rediscovered his genius and was looking forward to years of continued collaboration and creation. The tributes that poured in revealed the extent of his influence on artists across genres and generations, proving that his voice had provided comfort and inspiration even to those who had never met him personally. The funeral in Nashville became a gathering of musical royalty who understood that they were bidding farewell to something irreplaceable. The ceremony was both celebration of his achievements and acknowledgement of the suffering that had informed those achievements, a recognition that great art often comes from sources too painful to contemplate directly. The posthumous success of Mystery Girl provided a bittersweet conclusion to his story, proving that his final artistic statement would reach audiences who might never fully understand the journey that had created it. The album's commercial performance validated the comeback that had been cut short while ensuring that his family would be provided for financially. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction that followed his death served as official recognition of contributions that had already been acknowledged by every serious musician of his era. But the honor felt incomplete without the presence of the man whose voice had defined emotional authenticity for multiple generations of performers and listeners. His influence on subsequent artists became more apparent in the years following his death, as musicians continued to cite his example when explaining their own artistic choices. The voice that had seemed too powerful and too emotional for its own time proved to be prophetic of directions that popular music would eventually explore. The mystery of how someone could survive such devastating losses while continuing to create music of transcendent beauty remained unsolved at his death. Roy had somehow managed to transform the worst experiences human life could offer into art that provided comfort and understanding to millions of people who had never faced comparable tragedies. His legacy challenges both artists and audiences to consider the relationship between suffering and creativity, the price of emotional authenticity, and the possibility that some forms of beauty can only emerge from the deepest forms of pain. Roy Orbison proved that it was possible to sing your way through losses that should have destroyed you, but the cost of such survival was a life lived entirely in the service of art. The man behind the sunglasses had finally found peace, but the voice he left behind continued to offer solace to anyone who understood that sometimes the most beautiful sounds emerge from the darkest places. Every note he sang was for someone he had lost, and in the end we all became the beneficiaries of his grief. His story serves as both inspiration and warning. that art can provide meaning in the face of meaningless suffering, but that the artists who create such meaning often pay prices that the rest of us can barely comprehend. Roy Orbison didn't just sing about the human condition. He lived it at its most extreme edges, then somehow found the strength to transform that extremity into songs that made the rest of us feel less alone in our smaller sorrows. The sunglasses that had hidden his tears for so many years became a symbol not just of mystery, but of the protective barriers that sensitive souls must construct to survive in a world too harsh for their particular gifts. Behind those dark lenses lived a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and somehow continued to believe that music could make sense of it all. What hidden truths about the relationship between art and suffering might Roy Orbison's story reveal to future generations of artists who must choose between safety and authenticity, between protection and the kind of openness that creates transcendent art while leaving the artist vulnerable to destruction? The answer may determine whether his example serves as inspiration or cautionary tale for those brave enough to transform their pain into beauty for the benefit of strangers who will never fully understand the cost of such transformation.